The dust never stopped. For months it had settled thick over everything, fields, homes, and hopes. In the harsh winds, the earth was as much a battleground as the hearts of those who dared to farm it. As the storms raged on, one family made an impossible choice, a home half buried in the ground, built not for shelter but for survival. Before we dive into their story, tell us where you're watching from, and if tales of endurance in the Dust Bowl move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. The house was nothing like the others on the prairie. Most had fallen into disrepair, abandoned after the dust storms had swallowed them whole, their wooden frames barely standing against the relentless wind. But here, near the edge of a field that had once yielded a harvest full of promise, there was a different structure half buried in the earth, as if the land itself had decided to protect it. Emma stood at the entrance, her hands resting on the doorframe, her bare feet buried in the dirt. The sky had gone dark again, the winds howling outside, but it was a small comfort to know the dust wouldn't blow through the walls today. Her husband, John, had built the home with no intention of style or ease. The earth had become both their enemy and their salvation. The floor was made of packed soil, hardened by the pressure of the dirt he'd dug to reinforce the walls. It was cold here, but cold meant survival. Without the shelter of the earth, they'd have been lost long ago. Inside, the air was still, save for the occasional gust that sneaked in through the cracks. Emma moved through the dimly lit room, checking on the children, their faces pale and tired from the constant exposure to dust. The youngest, Clara, still held a smudge of dirt across her cheek, the kind of grime that didn't wash away, no matter how many times you scrubbed. Emma kissed her forehead before moving toward the table, where a small fire burned, weak and flickering. The Prossen spant in turn. Flames seemed to struggle against the chill in the air, but it was enough to keep the silence from closing in completely. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of thunder. But it wasn't rain that followed. The skies were too dry, the earth too barren for anything but more dust. The storms had become a familiar terror, one they knew all too well now. When John had first come home with the idea of digging into the earth to build a shelter, Emma had laughed at him. But that had been before the last storm nearly tore the roof from their cabin. The wind had picked up the soil, swirling it with such force that the house felt as though it might crumble under the weight. Now she knew better than to doubt his judgment. As the storms had taken their toll, John had only become more determined, and so, together, they had worked until the house took shape deep enough for the walls to shield them, but not so deep that they would become trapped should the ground shift. Still, there were nights when the wind howled so fiercely that even this half-buried refuge felt fragile, as if the world might collapse around them at any moment. But they were here, still. And for now, that was enough. John stood outside, his coat pulled tightly against his body, his face half hidden by a scarf. The wind had kicked up again, the dust swirling in endless spirals around him. He didn't mind it. He'd long ago stopped feeling the sting of the grit that found its way into every crevice of his skin. What mattered now was keeping the farm alive, despite the relentless storm and the odds stacked against them. The cattle had all but vanished, scattered in the dust, unable to find any grazing. John had tried everything, planting again and again, hoping that the next season would be different, but it was always the same. The soil cracked before the first shoots could break through. The ground beneath him had become like a living thing, pulling away from his hands, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. Emma had long stopped asking if things would get better. There was no room for hope, only survival. The earth had become a prison, holding them captive in a land that no longer cared for them. But he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. Not while his family was here, not while Emma and the kids still needed him. They had built this house together, and it would stand through the storm. He would make sure of it. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for something, anything, to break the monotony of dust and silence. And then, in the distance, he saw a flicker of light that didn't belong. A light on the horizon that seemed to pulse like a beacon, drawing him in. He turned toward it, his heart quickening as the wind howled louder, masking the sound of his footsteps. It was no mistake. The light wasn't natural, it was a fire. His first instinct was to run, to sprint toward it, but the thought of leaving the house unprotected, even for a few moments, stopped him. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't leave Emma and the children behind while the storm raged. But still, the light called to him, a silent promise that someone might be out there, fighting the same fight. As he turned to go back inside, the dust storm shifted once more, thickening the air around him. The crackle of distant thunder met his ears again, but this time he felt a strange sensation deep in his chest, the kind of stillness that came just before a decision was made. He couldn't ignore it. The fire was close, closer than he'd ever expected. John stood for a long moment in the doorway, the wind tugging at his coat and scarf, his eyes scanning the horizon. The distant flicker of the light had not gone out, and the strange sense of urgency in his chest would not fade. For a second, he considered calling Emma, but he knew her well enough to understand that she would not let him leave. She would want to go too. She would want to see who, if anyone, was out there in the middle of the storm. But he couldn't risk it, not with the children here. He took a deep breath, then stepped back into the shelter, his boots heavy in the packed dirt. The house felt colder inside than it had moments before. The walls seemed to press in, the silence of the space becoming more suffocating as he closed the door behind him. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness. She was sitting by the hearth, her back to him, her hands working on a small patch of fabric. She looked up at him, her tired eyes searching his face. "What is it, John?" He hesitated. The fire crackled faintly behind him, but it couldn't warm the chill in his bones. His eyes flicked back to the door, where the storm howled outside. "There's a light," he said, his voice low but urgent. "A fire out there, I think. I think someone else is out there." Emma's gaze followed his, and for a moment she said nothing. She let the quiet linger between them, her fingers pausing over the fabric before she spoke softly. "Should we go to them?" John's throat tightened. "We can't leave the house unguarded, not with the kids, but I don't know, Emma. Maybe we should try. Maybe there's someone out there who can help." She stood then, moving toward him with slow, measured steps. Her voice was gentle but firm when she spoke next. "You know what I think, John? I think you're hoping too much. We've got no place to go. No one is going to come find us in the middle of this dust." John swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. She was right, of course. No one would be coming. Not now, not after everything they'd lost. But still, the light, the flicker on the horizon. It couldn't just be a mirage. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I have to try." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the desperation and weariness of so many months of dust and hardship pushing through. "I can't just sit here and wait for the storm to swallow us whole." Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked over at their children, thin and pale, huddled on their blankets by the fire. Then she looked back at John, her face softening. "If you go, you're taking a risk, but if you believe there's something out there, I won't stop you. Just promise me you'll be careful. We can't lose you too." John nodded, a heavy weight lifting off his shoulders for the briefest moment. He had made up his mind. He would go. But he knew deep down that it wasn't just for help, it was because, in the deepest part of him, he still needed to believe that there was something beyond the dust, something that could bring them hope. The wind howled louder as John stepped outside, the sting of dust scratching at his skin, making his eyes water. His boots sank slightly into the dirt, and he pulled his scarf tighter around his face. The light, faint but constant, was still visible, even though the storm seemed to intensify with each passing minute. He couldn't explain it, but something in him stirred, pushing him forward. He paused just long enough to glance back at the shelter at Emma and the children inside, and then he turned away, feeling the weight of their silence on his shoulders. With every step, the storm seemed to press harder against him, the dust swirling in thick, choking clouds, making it difficult to see where the land ended and the sky began. It was as though the earth itself had turned into a wasteland, a place where no one could survive, but he would survive. He had to. The distant flicker of light grew larger as he walked, and with it, his hopes started to swell. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone else out here, a soul who had made it through the same endless storms and found some way to stay alive. John pushed forward, the wind whipping against his face, his heart pounding in his chest as his feet carried him deeper into the darkness. It was hard to tell. How much time had passed when he finally reached the light? His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight from the dust and the cold that seemed to seep into his bone. As he stepped forward, the figure of a small building appeared half hidden in the dust, just like his own home. The fire flickered at the entrance, faint and barely visible. He didn't hesitate. He moved closer, cautiously, calling out as he reached the door. "Hello?" His voice cracked under the weight of the storm, but it still echoed faintly through the desolation. "Is anyone there?" A figure appeared at the door, a shadow at first, and then a man stepped out wrapped in a heavy coat, his face covered in dust and grit. His eyes were tired, but there was a strength there that John immediately recognized. A fellow survivor. "You made it through the storm," the man said, his voice rough but steady. "You're the first one I've seen in days." John nodded, not trusting his voice yet. His body ached, but the relief of finding someone else, someone still holding on, pushed him forward. He had no idea what the man had been through, but at that moment, none of it mattered. There was still life out here, still a spark of something that could burn brighter than the storm. The man stepped aside, pulling the door open wider. "Come in," he said, motioning toward the warmth of the fire. "We've got shelter here, though it's not much, but it's better than nothing." John stepped inside without hesitation, his heart lifting even as the storm raged outside. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something more than dread. There was hope here. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wind had not yet fully subsided when John awoke, but the storm outside had softened to a quiet murmur. The house, or rather the shelter, was simple, more like a refuge carved into the earth than a home. Yet, in the dim light of early morning, it felt like the first real warmth he had known in what seemed like forever. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. John sat up slowly, the warmth of the fire still radiating through his clothes, his body aching but grateful for the rest. He had no idea how long he had been asleep, but the man who had taken him in was already awake, sitting by the fire, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. The stranger's face was weathered, his hands worn from the same labor and struggle that John knew all too well. They were both survivors, two souls bound by the dust and the harshness of this land. The stranger didn't look at John immediately, but after a moment he spoke. "You've got a family out there, don't you?" His voice was quiet, as though he had asked the question many times before, perhaps to other survivors who had passed through his makeshift shelter. John nodded, his eyes momentarily drifting to the door, to the world beyond the walls of this place. "A wife. Emma. 2 kids. We've got a small cabin, but the storms keep coming. The land, it's like it's turning against us." His voice faltered at the end, the weight of the admission heavier than he had expected. For so long he had carried that fear alone, hidden it from Emma. But here, with this stranger, the burden felt a little lighter. The man nodded, understanding, and took a slow sip of the coffee. "It's the same everywhere," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "We build, we dig, we fight. But the land, it doesn't care. Not anymore." John didn't know how to respond to that, but the truth of it settled in his chest like a stone. The land, once a source of life, had become a force of nature, indifferent to their struggles. It was as if the earth itself had grown tired of their attempts to tame it. They sat in silence for a long while, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. The quiet felt like a heavy weight, but it wasn't. Uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people understand the same pain without needing to explain it. Finally, John spoke again, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Do you think it'll ever end? The storms?" The man leaned back, staring into the fire, his face unreadable. "End? I don't know, but we keep going. That's all we can do. We survive." John nodded. Survive. For who, though? The stranger met his eyes then, his gaze steady. For yourself. For them. For the chance that one day you'll look out and see the sun again, even if it's just for a little while. The words felt strange to John, almost too hopeful, like a dream too far from reach. But in that moment, as the warmth of the fire wrapped around him and the distant sound of the storm continued to rumble like a sleeping giant, he let himself believe them. Outside, the light had begun to change. the pale sky hinting at the possibility of a new day. It wasn't clear yet whether it would be another stormy day, or a rare reprieve, but in the quiet after the storm, John realized that it no longer mattered as much. What mattered was that they were here alive and they had found each other, if only for a while. As he looked back at the stranger, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred inside him hope. Maybe not for the land, but for the people who could survive it, for the ones who still chose to keep fighting, to keep going. They would survive, together. And with that, John stood, the weight of the dust no longer quite so heavy on his shoulders. There was work to do, there were more days ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he was no longer afraid of what they might bring. The storm outside might rage again, but he knew this much: they would face it together. And that was enough.